Another night, another path through time. Before the winds guide us into ancient Celtic battles and songs, show your support with a like, a subscribe, and a share. Find stillness. Let each breath carry you further away from today, tonight. The past is our lullaby. Welcome to episode 9. In an earlier lecture, I talked a little bit about English incursions into Wales in the 11th century. In this lecture, I want to tell the story of Wales from the 11th century down to about the 15th century. I'll talk about the tangled politics within Wales itself, and about the complicated relationship between Wales and England that culminated in the conquest of Wales. Finally, I'll say something about the fascinating literature of medieval Wales. Let's start with some basic facts about Welsh society. Wales, like Ireland, was very culturally unified, but it was politically divided, partly due to its geography. The terrain is quite mountainous, and although the mountains are not all that high, the topography is challenging enough to make it easy for authority to be fragmented into small units, perhaps as small in some cases as a single valley. Nevertheless, there were several large centers of power, or what we might call petty kingdoms. But the ability of these kings or lords to control their followers was very tenuous, and persistent succession struggles continually worked against the creation of political stability. The political center of gravity could shift according to the personal abilities of each successive ruler. Throughout the Middle Ages, Wales was divided along geographic lines roughly into thirds. In the south, there were a series of small kingdoms ranging from Dyfed in the southwest to Gwent in the southeast. In central Wales, the dominant power was the kingdom of Powys. The most important lordship, however, was Gwynedd in the northwest, where several generations of rulers were able to exert a loose overlordship over many of the other Welsh princes. It was Gwynedd that would produce the closest thing we ever see to a native ruler over all of Wales. Of course, the most important geographic fact in Welsh history has been the relationship with its larger and richer neighbor to the east. The history of relations between England and Wales is long and complicated. It goes back to the period of the Germanic settlements, when the area of Celtic speech slowly receded westward across the country. As I said in my lecture about Britain after the fall of Rome, a more or less stable situation developed whereby Celtic-speaking rulers were confined to the area we now know as Wales, but there was still considerable cross-border raiding between Wales and the various English kingdoms. It was to defend against such raids that King Offa of the English Kingdom of Mercia built his famous dike in the 8th century, large sections of which can still be seen today. In the subsequent few centuries, there was the occasional serious incident when Welsh rulers would cause trouble on the English side of the border, or vice versa, but these raids were usually rather ephemeral. The dynamic changed considerably with the Norman conquest of England in 1066. Under the early Norman kings, English settlers made inroads in Wales, intending not just to seize plunder or teach the natives a lesson, but rather to settle permanently. The Normans had some lasting successes, especially in the south, where they created a colony in what is now Pembrokeshire, but ultimately provided some of the most prominent members of the contingent that embarked on the conquest of Ireland in the 12th century. But the Normans had never really conquered the whole place, and in fact, some of their early gains in North Wales in the late 11th century were wiped out when the powerful ruler of Gwynedd, Griffith ap Cynon, defeated and killed the Norman lord Robert of Frython. The Welsh also drove out the Norman-imposed Bishop of Bangor, Hervey le Breton, who was forced to beg King Henry I of England for another job. He ended up as Bishop of the new See of Ely all the way in eastern England, as far away from Wales as he could get. Wales proved a tougher nut to crack than England had, in part because political authority was so divided. Whereas in 1066 the Normans had been able to make significant gains just by defeating King Harold of England, in Wales, the ruler of Powys did not feel bound to follow the lead of the ruler of Gwynedd, or vice versa. Of course, whenever the political situation in England was difficult, the Welsh tended to take advantage. but the division within Wales cut both ways, since the Welsh fought with each other as much as they did with the English. They had great difficulty in unifying sufficiently to see off the English threat for good. Periodically, though, as I mentioned, Wales did produce leaders who made a run at establishing hegemony over the whole country. The most important came from Gwynedd, and I'll just talk about two of them. I'm afraid they are both named Llywelyn. The first is named Llywelyn ap Iorwerth, which means Llywelyn, son of Iorwerth. A quick word about Welsh naming practices. The word ap in Llywelyn ap Iorwerth comes from map, which means son, and through one of those initial mutations that the Celtic languages are famous for, the M disappears and we're just left with ap. Incidentally, this is one of the places where you can see the difference between P Celtic and Q Celtic languages the most clearly. The word map is the exact equivalent of the Irish word mac, as you find in countless Irish and Scottish surnames. But back to Llywelyn ap Iorwerth. He was also known as Llywelyn Fawr, or Llywelyn the Great. How did he get that nickname? By extending his overlordship over much of Wales, and by dealing with the English on virtually an equal footing. Llywelyn's story is a good one because it brings up a theme that recurs in Welsh history. We have in Wales the phenomenon that was characteristic of all the Celtic-speaking regions, the lack of clear rules for the succession. As we saw in the lecture on medieval Scotland, one of the ways in which the Scots achieved a fairly stable political system was by adopting English-style primogeniture. That didn't happen in Wales. Llywelyn was the grandson of a previous king of Gwynedd, but he had to fight two of his uncles and then a cousin to establish himself as ruler, and he was never entirely safe from challenges by members of his own family. Still, Llywelyn must have been a man of great charisma and personal authority, because he did manage to assert his hegemony over most of the native rulers in Wales, though this hegemony was fairly loose. Nothing like the English king's power over his vassals and officials. One of the clearest signs of Llywelyn's authority was the fact that he made a peace treaty with King John of England in 1200, and he even married John's illegitimate daughter, Joan. This brings me to an interesting aspect of Welsh society that also parallels what we see in Ireland, namely the fact that the rules of marriage were a little different from those in England. In Wales and Ireland, the marital status of the parents was less important in determining whether a child had inheritance rights. The key question was whether the father acknowledged paternity. The church was attempting to change this, and in fact, Llywelyn himself had gotten the church to back him in his struggle against his uncles by claiming that the uncles were illegitimate. But it was still true that legitimacy or illegitimacy wasn't really seen as that big a deal, and thus it was a pretty major coup for Llywelyn to marry even the illegitimate daughter of the English king. Llywelyn, though, was trying to change the rules and insist on legitimate status for heirs in Wales. In fact, he was trying to normalize the inheritance system so that it looked more like the English system, very much along the lines of what the Scottish kings had been doing since the late 11th century. The idea in both Wales and Scotland was to try to make the rules clearer, and also to conform to the customs of the Anglo-Norman world so that it was easier to get along with their neighbors. In a certain sense, Llywelyn was trying to at least partly assimilate Wales' English norms. The relationship between Llywelyn and King John of England did not work out well, however, and here we see another important theme in Welsh history come into play: disunity among the Welsh rulers. Llywelyn seems to have allied himself with the English noble family of druids, which held lands along the Welsh border. But then the druids fell out with King John, when Llywelyn was drawn into the dispute. King John's supporter, the Earl of Chester, then attacked Gwynedd. In 1211, King John invaded Gwynedd personally, and here is the kicker: John was supported by most of the other princes of Wales, who were trying to ally with John in order to put Llywelyn in his place and preserve their own autonomy. John was able to seize a number of hostages from Llywelyn, These hostages were adolescent sons of Llywelyn's major supporters, and John planned to hold them to guarantee that Llywelyn would keep the peace. But the Welsh ruler nevertheless defied John, so the following year, in 1212, John planned a second invasion, and he had even begun executing the hostages when, we learn from one account, a message arrived from John's daughter Joan, Llywelyn's wife, warning him that if he invaded Wales again, his own nobles, the English nobles, would rise up and overthrow him. I mentioned briefly that John had fallen out with his vassals, the de Brieux family. Well, the de Brieuxes were not John's only domestic enemies, and in this case, John's difficulty was Llywelyn's opportunity. John was quickly hurtling towards the confrontation with his barons that would culminate in him being forced to accept Magna Carta in 1215, and Llywelyn allied himself with these rebellious barons. He captured the English border town of Shrewsbury in support of the rebels' efforts to force John into a settlement. So John's Welsh invasion was abandoned, and a few years later, the text of the Great Charter would specifically call on John to release the remaining Welsh hostages, including one of Llywelyn's illegitimate sons. Llywelyn went on to rule Gwynedd and to dominate Wales until his death in 1240. He certainly earned his nickname of Llywelyn the Great. The second Llywelyn I want to talk about is his grandson, Llywelyn ap Gruffydd. He was in fact the son of Llywelyn the Great's illegitimate son, Gruffydd, the hostage who was released under the terms of Magna Carta. Llywelyn the Great had passed over Gruffydd in the succession in favor of his legitimate son, Dafydd, whose mother was Princess Joan. But almost inevitably, after the death of their father, the two half-brothers fought each other for the rulership of Gwynedd. The English king Henry III used this internecine dispute in Wales to his advantage to keep the Welsh at each other's throats, and it was in a sense only a happy accident that by 1246, Gruffydd's son Llywelyn was the last man standing. I'm somewhat giving away the ending, though, when I tell you that his nickname is Llywelyn ein Llyw Olaf, which translates roughly as Llywelyn the Last, as in the last Prince of Wales. Some of the same themes we saw during the reign of the first Llywelyn also characterize the reign of his grandson. One of these is the fact that Wales always did well when England was in political turmoil. King Henry III of England faced a major baronial revolt in the 1250s and 60s, and Llywelyn allied with the king's main opponent, Simon de Montfort, though Simon was ultimately killed in battle in 1265. And we see a repeat of the fluctuating alliances between the English king and the other rulers of Wales, who were not always thrilled about one of their number being first among equals. So how did Llywelyn ap Gruffydd become Llywelyn the Last? The final conquest of Wales came about when Llywelyn clashed with the son and successor of King Henry III, Edward I, over the feudal homage that Llywelyn supposedly owed to the English king under the terms of the Treaty of Montgomery, signed in 1267. Relations between Edward and Llywelyn were not improved when Llywelyn married Simon de Montfort's daughter, Eleanor, who, by the way, was Edward's first cousin, since Simon de Montfort was married to King Henry's sister. It is hard to exaggerate how closely intertwined all of these people were with each other. King Edward saw this marriage as a power move by the Welsh ruler and tried to prevent it from taking place. Throughout the 1270s, there were repeated clashes between Edward and Llywelyn. The English king made use of Llywelyn's resentful and treacherous younger brother Dafydd, who had actually plotted to assassinate Llywelyn as a means of fomenting discontent in Gwynedd. Dafydd was quite willing to go along with Edward's plan to conquer much of Wales and set Dafydd up as ruler of a small remaining territory. By 1277, Llywelyn had been forced to concede large tracts of Welsh land to English rule. The end came in 1282, and it was precipitated by Dafydd. Many of the Welsh lords who were now effectively under English lordship due to Edward's previous conquests thought better of their support for English rule once it became clear that Edward would be a harsh overlord, and David himself precipitated a rebellion against the English. Llewellyn felt obliged to support his brother, God knows why, and he was forced into a war that he was ill prepared to fight. In December 1282, Llewellyn was killed in battle, and his head was displayed in London for the next 15 years. After Llewellyn's death, King Edward made it his business to conquer all of Wales once and for all, and he made sure of his conquest by building a series of impressive castles, many of which still stand today. If you look at the way the castles are distributed on a map, it is quite clear that they were planned to place a kind of cordon around Gwynedd, but you also see some of them extending down the westward coast of Wales. They've ranged today from very ruined to quite well preserved. For example, Aberystwyth Castle is pretty ruinous now, as is Flint Castle, but at the other end of the spectrum is Friesland Castle, which is pretty intact. Finally, I want to mention Carnarvon Castle, where Edward I's son, Edward, was born in 1284. He later became Edward II. This young prince became the first heir to the English throne to be named Prince of Wales, a tradition that continues to this day. There's a later story that after the conquest of Wales, Edward I promised the Welsh that he would give them a prince born in Wales who spoke no English. It was, of course, a trick, because he really meant his infant son, Edward, who, at the time, spoke no language of any kind. Incidentally, when the current holder of the title, Prince Charles, was preparing to be inaugurated as Prince of Wales, he took a crash course in Welsh. I have no idea how much Welsh he remembers today. The story of King Edward's trick on the Welsh is probably apocryphal, but it does say something about relations between the Welsh and the English. It was a pretty thorough, brutal conquest. Of all of England's attempts to subdue the lands of the Celtic fringe, the efforts against Wales had the most success. Those castles did the trick. Wales still retains a separate cultural identity, but the political integration with England has been quite complete. I'd like to make a quick digression here into modern British politics. The question of the status of the Prince of Wales in the modern period is quite interesting because of the recent changes made to the long-standing British rules of succession that traditionally preferred male children to female children in the royal line. It used to be the case that all the sons of a monarch came first in the line of succession before any of the daughters, even if the daughters were older. For example, the oldest child of Queen Victoria was Princess Victoria, but the heir to the throne was her younger brother, Albert Edward, who became Prince of Wales and later succeeded to the throne as Edward VII. 4 decades later, King George VI had 2 daughters and no sons, so the question of preferring a younger brother to an older sister did not arise. Then both Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Charles produced male children first, so again there was no question. In the meantime, of course, the views of society about relations between the genders had undergone a dramatic shift, and it no longer seemed natural for males to be preferred to females. When Prince Charles's first son, Prince William, married Catherine Middleton in 2011, the British Parliament faced an impending situation. What if the first child of the royal couple was a girl followed by a boy? Would the British public stand for it if the younger boy displaced the older girl? It was decided that something needed to be done, and a new law was passed to change the rules and get rid of the gender preference altogether. Parliament took the same opportunity to get rid of the rule that the heir to the throne cannot marry a Catholic, which was left over from a period when England was afraid of domination by Catholic countries on the continent of Europe. The reason all of this is interesting from a Welsh perspective is that while there have been plenty of princesses of Wales who were the wives of princes of Wales, there has technically never been a princess of Wales in her own right. When Queen Elizabeth was the heir, it was briefly proposed that she be named Princess of Wales, but this never went anywhere. Supposedly, Elizabeth herself was not keen on the idea. But in the future, provided the monarchy continues, there may very well be a Princess of Wales rather than a Prince of Wales. So what happened after the conquest of Edward I in Wales? The country was suppressed remarkably quickly. There were a few uprisings, but nothing major until the revolt of Owain Glyndwr in 1400, made famous in Shakespeare's play Henry IV, Part 1. Here the figure of Owain is seen as rather flighty and unreliable, obsessed with magic and prophecy, though in fact the real Owain was a substantial figure. He was descended from the native princes of Powys in central Wales, and he entered into a major conspiracy with two English rebel lords, with the idea that the three men would divide the island of Britain 3 ways. Owain's two English confederates were defeated at the Battle of Shrewsbury in 1403, but Owain managed to hang on against the English until 1409, when he was forced into hiding. He was last spotted in 1412, and there was a report of his death in 1416, but since it is not known where he died or where his body is, a legend grew up that, like King Arthur, Owain would come again to restore the fortunes of the Welsh people. I mentioned that Shakespeare does not treat Owain very kindly, but Shakespeare didn't look down on all the Welsh. One of his most interesting minor characters, in my opinion, is the Welsh Captain Llewellyn from the play Henry V. It's a play filled with scoundrels and characters who are ambivalent at best, but Llewellyn is one of the only truly honorable men in the play. And Henry himself claims Welsh identity in the play. "For I am Welsh, you know." And this is due to his birth at Monmouth in Wales. It's interesting to note that while the English have entertained some rather vicious stereotypes about the Irish and about the Highland Scots, they've never been quite as negatively disposed towards the Welsh. I think one reason for this is that the Welsh were conquered comparatively early in the history of England. Any fears the English may have had about the Welsh were laid to rest long ago. Still, Wales remained undeveloped in comparison to England, and it seemed to the English like the back of beyond, when this remoteness led to the rise of an expression that sounds like it is an ethnic slur against the Welsh, but it really isn't. Back in the 18th century, when debtors' prisons still existed, people who were afraid of being arrested for debt sometimes fled to Wales, where it was harder to track people down. Some of the people who did this were actually bookmakers who could not pay off their bets. They would flee to Wales, and this was called welshing on a bet. Nowadays, this refers generally to people who refuse or fail to pay their debts of honor. So it's not actually an insult against Welsh people's honesty, but it is a reminder that Wales was seen as a place to go to when you needed to disappear. Let's return for the remainder of this lecture to Welsh literature produced during the Middle Ages. The corpus of medieval Welsh literature is not as extensive as the Irish one, but it has arguably been far more influential on European literature as a whole. One remarkable thing to note about this literature is that much of what we have is preserved in only 2 manuscripts. The White Book of Rother, so called because it is bound in white leather, which was written in southwest Wales in about 1350, and the Red Book of Hergest, this one bound in red leather, which was written after 1382 along the border with England. And incidentally, J.R.R. Tolkien named his fictional manuscript that supposedly contained the Lord of the Rings stories the Red Book of Westmarch, after the Red Book of Hergest. So what is this corpus of Welsh literature? The oldest literary texts we have are poems from the early Middle Ages. They include some beautiful laments for the loss of love and youth, as well as the epic poem The Gododin, which I talked about in several earlier lectures as part of the literary legacy of the Old North, the regions of northern Britain that had once been Celtic-speaking. Much of what was produced from the 11th century onwards consists of praise poetry for the Welsh princess. Just as we see in Ireland and Scotland, Welsh princes commissioned poetry and historical texts to boost their standing among their subjects and fellow rulers. And by the way, it's not unheard of for rulers in non-Celtic speaking areas to commission flattering literary works. It's just that in the Celtic regions, this is taken to an extreme, and even relatively minor lords did it. Some of this flattery was really kind of absurd. You might have long poems praising a guy who, at the most, controlled one valley. But this is a poor society that largely operates on face-to-face contacts and word of mouth, and praise is one of the major lubricants of the system. The most influential works of Welsh medieval literature, though, are the 4 anonymous prose tales, known collectively as the Mabinogi, commonly but not technically correctly referred to as the Mabinogion, as well as the tales that relate to King Arthur, which I talk about in another lecture. These tales became popular in France and then throughout Europe, and they still influence popular culture to this day. The Mabinogi is a puzzling work if you just come to it cold. The 4 tales are often referred to as the 4 branches, but if you read them, you're not exactly sure what they are branches of. They're interrelated. There are some characters that occur in more than one of the stories, but the relationship between them doesn't seem especially close. I'll just run through some quick plot summaries of the first 2 branches to give you a sense of what we're talking about. In the first branch, which is called Pwyll, Prince of Dyfed, the title character, Pwyll, does a service for the lord of the underworld, Arawn, and is rewarded with a mysterious supernatural bride named Rhiannon, who rides a horse that can never be caught up with, even when it seems to be merely walking. Rhiannon and Pwyll have many adventures before they can finally marry, but Rhiannon eventually bears a son, Pryderi. The core of the story is the disappearance of the infant Pryderi, for which Rhiannon is initially blamed, but Pryderi is eventually restored to his rightful place and succeeds Pwyll in ruling Dyfed. In the second branch, which is called Branwen, daughter of Thyr, we have completely new characters. Branwen is the sister of Bran the Blessed, King of Britain. The King of Ireland, Matholwch, asks for her hand in marriage, which Bran grants. But because Branwen's half-brother Efnisien is not consulted on the matter, Efnisien angrily mutilates the horses of the Irish delegation, and a lasting resentment is created. Once Branwen is back in Ireland, she produces a son, Gwern, but she is badly treated at the Irish court, and the king forces her to work in the kitchens. She trains a starling to bring word of her predicament back to King Bran, who invades Ireland on her behalf. Should mention here that Bran is a giant. He is so large that he can wade across the Irish Sea. Once he arrives, Branwen makes peace between her husband and her brother, but war breaks out again due to Efnisien, who seizes his nephew Gwern and throws him on the fire. The 2 sides proceed to slaughter each other, though the action is prolonged by the fact that the Irish possess a magic cauldron that can bring the dead back to life. Bran is finally killed as well, and his head is cut off, though it continues to talk, and the head is then buried in London at the site of the later Tower of London, where it will supposedly ward off invasion. And this story may or may not be connected to the tradition that England will be safe as long as ravens live at the tower. The name Bran means crow in Welsh, and ravens are closely related to crows. Branwen also returns to Britain only to die of grief. I won't describe the other 2 branches in detail, but they contain the same marvelous mixture of supernatural elements and human drama. Scholars have several different theories about what the Mabinogi is supposed to be about. Many scholars have claimed that these stories preserve original Celtic mythology. Characters such as Arawn and Rhiannon certainly seem to represent gods of some kind. One of the most interesting theories argues that the first branch of the Mabinogi preserves a memory of the raid of the Celts on Delphi in 270 BC. This is almost certainly not the case. As we have seen, it is highly unlikely that the people living in Wales in the Middle Ages had any particular connection to the Galatai who attacked Delphi in the 3rd century BC. This theory is a remnant of the old Celtic hypothesis that saw one overarching Celtic civilization preserving its tales throughout the Celtic areas down through the centuries. More recently, scholars have suggested that whatever the origins of these tales might be, and surely they do have their roots in ancient mythology in some fashion, their current form reflects a sophisticated literary sensibility. The style of the prose is highly polished and very pleasing, and there are subtle touches that weave the four tales together, even though it can be hard to see the connections at first blush, since they don't all contain the same characters. Not everybody loves the Mabinogi, but I do, and I highly recommend giving it a try. Finally, I want to mention a Welsh literary figure who lived a little bit later than the authors of the Mabinogi, during the period after the English conquest, the great poet Dafydd ap Gwilym. Dafydd lived in the middle of the 14th century, though we're unsure of the exact dates. He wrote with great wit and verve about both love and nature, and here are excerpts from just two of my favorites. The first is from The Girls of Llanbadarn. I am bent with wrath, a plague upon all the women of this parish, for I've never had a single one. The second is from a poem whose title I won't give away, but it might help to explain the poet's difficulties with women. I always deemed my features bright and beautiful and fair, until yon mirror met my sight, when lo, an ugly face was there. Thou blue round moon, thou drear delusion, thou magnet-fashioned sorceress, thou world of dreams and dire confusion, ice-like in hue and brittleness, let hell consume the hateful, thin, bent-lipped mirror. These poems truly are wonderful. We really feel we get to know the poet and his personal frustrations and delights. Despite the political difficulties the Welsh experienced, they were able to take refuge in a remarkable literary tradition that laid the foundations for what is arguably the strongest surviving Celtic language today. In this lecture, I'm going to pick up where I left off in an earlier lecture about Ireland in the Middle Ages and tell the story of the final clash between the English and the Irish that led to the Tudor conquest of Ireland. Along the way, we'll look particularly at the question of how Irish identity played a role in English policy in Ireland, and we'll use the example of the experience of one of the most important families in Irish history, the O'Neills, who had to figure out repeatedly where they stood on the spectrum between Irish and English identity. We'll also look at the English policy of plantation, which was a concerted effort to wipe out Irish culture, if not the Irish themselves, and turn Ireland into another England. This conflict obviously has deep roots in the Middle Ages. In my lecture on the English invasion of Ireland, I talked about how the English had never completely conquered Ireland, and as a result, there was an uneasy coexistence on the island between the Irish and the English settlers, many of whom adopted a great many aspects of Irish culture, including the Irish language, but for the most part, without changing their political allegiance. This situation was inherently unstable, and from the late 15th century through the 16th century, the English government tried a number of expedients in an effort to solve the Irish problem. For quite a while, these various experiments in policy just came and went, causing more or less exasperation among the English officials as they all failed in their turn. But the question of how to rule Ireland was suddenly crucially important in the 1530s, when Henry VIII broke with the Catholic Church. All of a sudden, England was on the wrong side of the major Catholic powers in Europe, particularly Spain, which was especially aggrieved that the Reformation in England had been touched off by Henry's rejection of his Spanish bride, Catherine of Aragon. Ireland now represented a security threat for England, because it was a perfect backdoor for the Spanish to use in a potential invasion of England. There was a precedent for this. Way back in the late 15th century, after the Tudor victory in the Wars of the Roses, two Yorkist pretenders actually invaded England from Ireland, and they had foreign help. In fact, one of them was helped by Scotland. So the English were very afraid of their Spanish enemies joining forces with the Irish. And the religious factor did not help matters. Naturally, the English tended to identify Catholicism with disloyalty and the threat of invasion by Catholic powers. Now in Ireland, almost all of the native Irish stayed Catholic. Plus, a very large proportion of the English settler community also stayed Catholic. The Spanish king was likely to listen with a sympathetic ear to pleas for help from Catholics in Ireland. And that was very dangerous to the English, especially because now the settlers and the native Irish might make common cause on religious grounds. So this made Ireland seem like even more of a threat to the English authorities. From the 1530s on, in addition to military action when required, the English government pursued two other main avenues towards pacification in Ireland, and they assumed that these two approaches were in harmony with each other. The first was Anglicization. The English assumed that one of the main reasons why the Irish opposed English rule was that they were savages. If they were persuaded of the superiority of the English way of life and of English government, they would naturally consent to be ruled peacefully by the English king. The second approach was Protestantization. Again, the English government felt that the more the Irish could be brought to conform to the new English state religion, the more peaceful they would be. One of the most interesting experiments in this effort to convert the Irish to both Protestantism and Englishness came during the reign of Henry VIII. This was the policy that later historians have called surrender and regrant. The main idea was to try to turn the leaders of the Irish community into good English lords, and that would make them loyal. Then the lower social ranks in Ireland would naturally follow along. And it's the flip side of the assumption that if the English settlers are acting too Irish, their political loyalty must be suspect. Now, if you can change the culture of the Irish, if you can get them to act English, you might also change their political allegiance. Or so the English thought. This is how it worked. An Irish lord would acknowledge the king's authority in Ireland and receive in exchange a grant of the territory he already held, but it would be an official grant. Where previously the English government might not have recognized the Irish lord's right to the land, now his ownership would be sanctioned by the English state. If he was a major landowner, he would get an English title. He would be made the Earl of this or the Baron of that. Hereafter, he would be treated as English. He would be equal in law to an English nobleman. In return, he would be expected to adopt English customs and learn the English language. There's actually a famous contemporary engraving of an Irish lord doing this, surrendering his lands, and he is wearing English clothes and an English haircut as a sign of his willingness to follow the rules of the grant. The result of this adoption of English ways was supposed to be harmony between English and Irish. No more barriers would remain. And for the first time, it did seem realistic to think this might be achieved, at least on the legal front. Up until this point, the legal situation in Ireland had been very confused. In some areas, English law was followed. In other areas, the old Brehon law of traditional Irish society held sway. There were also many areas where the system in use was a kind of mishmash of English and Irish law, called marcher law, named for the marches or border areas. But now, the English started trying to create a uniform English-style legal infrastructure for Ireland. They established new courts and expanded the system of justices of the peace into some of the previously purely Irish areas. Slowly but steadily, they crowded out the Brehon law, so that now, if someone wanted legal redress, they had to go to the English courts. Before this, the situation had been reversed. In the Irish areas, English people had to use Brehon law if they wanted any justice at all. So this all sounds good, right? Well, there were some structural difficulties with the surrender and regrant program, at least on the Irish side. One of the most important of these problems had to do with the differences between the ways in which the English and the Irish handled the ownership of land. Under the English system, title to land was held by a single individual. Under the Irish system, members of the extended family had certain rights in the land that could not be completely alienated by one landowner. These rights essentially disappeared under the surrender and regrant system. Surrender and regrant worked reasonably well in many cases, since the incentives for the chiefs were so clear. If the English acknowledged your title, they would leave you alone. That was worth going through a little ceremony and taking a wee oath or two. So during the course of 1541 and 1542, a steady stream of Irish chiefs presented themselves before the Lord Deputy to surrender their lands and receive them back with English-style titles. Probably the two most impressive catches were the two most important Irish chiefs from Ulster, Manus O'Donnell and Con O'Neill. But this change was not necessarily fine for all of the extended family members of these chiefs, who would be losing out. As you might expect, this would cause major friction within an Irish family where the rules of succession could already tend to foster family disputes. Thus, surrender and regrant, which was supposed to create more stability from the English perspective, would sometimes have the opposite effect. A key example of this tendency for the policy to destabilize the Irish lordships is the case of the surrender by Con O'Neill, who was made the first Earl of Tyrone. This was a huge propaganda success for the English. Now, in that submission, O'Neill made some substantial concessions. He promised to attend the Irish Parliament in Dublin, which from the English side was seen as a great privilege, of course. He promised to renounce the practice of charging black rent, which was basically a kind of protection money that Irish lords extracted from the beleaguered English settlers. He promised to renounce papal authority. There's the Protestant part of the equation. And he promised to keep the king's peace. So that was what Con O'Neill promised to do while he was alive. What would happen after his death? We will come back to that shortly. Surrender and regrant had a troubled legacy. It did succeed in integrating many Irish lords into the English system. But there was also some pushback from people who felt that surrender and regrant was a betrayal of Irish culture. Prominent among these detractors were the Irish bards. Remember, these were exactly the people whom the English did not want their own people to patronize because they represented so much concentrated Irishness. There's a wonderful poem from this period written by Leisach MacInvard that really captures this dichotomy between the old Irish ways and the new English ways, and it certainly draws on the rich Irish tradition of satire. The poem draws a sharp contrast between a native Irish rebel named Owen Bawn and an unnamed Irish man who has been seduced by the new English style. The poet merely addresses him as the man who follows English ways. First, MacInvard criticizes his target for cutting his long flowing hair short in the English fashion. He compares him to a tonsured monk. And he criticizes him too for wearing English-style clothes, including a long satin scarf and a high Dutch collar. Remember, clothing and hairstyles were traditional points of contention between the English and the Irish. The poet also mocks the English-style weapon that the man who follows English ways carries. He calls it a blunt rapier that would not kill a fly. Basically, MacInvard is insulting the manhood of his victim. If the English thought that Irish ways were savage, the Irish thought that English ways were effeminate. Well, it became clear early on that surrender and regrant was not going to put an end to Irish rebellions, so the English turned to another policy with far-reaching consequences in Irish history: plantation. The sense of the word here as that you will bring in English people and turn the area to be planted into a sort of island of Englishness. Plantation was a direct response to specific Irish rebellions. It was started in the 1540s and 50s in response to a revolt in the Irish Midlands, and then extended to the southwest in the 1580s. The legal basis for plantation was the continued rebellion of the natives against royal authority. The way the English government proceeded was to issue bills of attainder against the rebels. A bill of attainder is a law passed against a named individual. Under these bills, their lands were confiscated. Now, bills of attainder are mentioned in the United States Constitution because Americans are not allowed to have bills of attainder. So Parliament passed laws against the specific Irish rebels whose lands they wanted to confiscate. Once the land had been confiscated, it had to be anglicized. The plan was to survey the territory to be planted and parcel it up into English acres and group it into English-style manors. They would be further organized into shires, baronies, and townships. So on the macro level as well as the micro level, the land is going to be organized and measured along English lines. And in addition to some rather obvious military provisions like a ban on helping the Irish rebels, obviously, there were some strictly cultural measures as well. Any Irish people living in the plantation had to adopt English dress, teach their children English, and attend the deputy annually. They had to abandon the Brehon law and use only English common law. And there was a penalty for marrying or fostering with the neighboring Irish. They were really supposed to turn their backs on their Irish past. Now, I need to make a point that's very important here about plantation. As we've seen, there are two controversial identity issues in Tudor Ireland: religious identity, Catholic versus Protestant, and cultural identity, Irish versus English. But these could operate independently of each other. The highly anglicizing policy of plantation got its start under a Catholic monarch of England, Mary Tudor. For Mary, the status of the Irish as Catholics did not wipe out the problem of their being Irish. But because Mary died soon after plantation got underway, and the religious policy of the English government shifted with it, back to Protestantism, plantation quickly got associated in people's minds with Protestantism, and that turned out to be a toxic combination, or made those who didn't like plantation turn against Protestantism, and it made those who didn't like Protestantism resist plantation. Let's now turn back for a moment to the O'Neill family, who are the most important family in Ulster in the north of Ireland, and we'll see how the problems of balancing the demands of both Irish and English identity played out. In 1559, Con O'Neill, the Earl of Tyrone, died, leaving two sons as claimants to the earldom: Matthew, the elder, and therefore the official English-sponsored claimant, and Shane, the younger, but the most prominent of the claimants under the Irish system. What were the English going to do? It would have been simplest to recognize Dane O'Neill as Earl, because Shane was the strongest claimant and a very able diplomat and military leader. But there were reasons not to recognize him. Shane had close ties to the Scots, who were not friendly towards the English at this point, and he was arming local peasants in an apparent effort to prepare for rebellion. Shane was clearly seen to be a serious threat to English rule in Ireland. The English Lord Deputy Sussex said of Shane, "If Shane be overthrown, all is settled. If Shane settle, all is overthrown." In June 1561, with the Queen's patience running out, Shane was invited to London for negotiations, and Shane's visit to London was a public relations triumph. The ladies of the court were apparently very intrigued by the handsome Shane and by his exotic followers with their long hair and their Irish-style clothes. But they also noted that he easily adapted to his courtly surroundings. The Irish elite was becoming bicultural. So peace seemed to be at hand, But then, totally unexpectedly, during Shane's visit to London, Shane's rival, Matthew O'Neill, was assassinated, and his killers threw their support behind a different O'Neill claimant named Turlough Linna. And this led Shane to return to Ireland to try to fight for his rights among his own kin. And because he had broken the peace with the English government, he was now at war with England. It took nearly 5 years to suppress the rebellion, and in fact it only ended when Shane was forced to seek help from a local Ulster lord with Scottish connections named Alexander Oge MacDonald. Shane was received with signs of friendship, but then he was killed during a banquet, no doubt as part of a conspiracy with the English. Shane had not managed to balance the different political demands of the English world and the Irish world. But the O'Neills were not finished yet. Next, I want to look at the last major revolts in Ireland during the reign of Elizabeth I. The 9 Years' War, which began in 1593, dwarfed any previous rebellion in scope and size. It posed the most serious threat to English rule in Ireland, certainly since the Bruce invasion of the early 14th century, mainly because of the fear of Spanish intervention in Ireland. English and Irish forces in this revolt were well balanced, and it might possibly have turned out differently. The key figure in this revolt was a man named Hugh O'Neill. Hugh O'Neill was the second son of Matthew O'Neill, the English-sanctioned heir to the first Earl of Tyrone, Con O'Neill. Hugh had become the official English claimant to the earldom when he was only 12 years old. His childhood was very interesting because it shows us how these Irish noblemen were increasingly operating in two worlds, Irish and English. When Hugh became the heir, he was brought to the Pale, the area around Dublin that was culturally English, and then raised partly in England. So he was completely bilingual and, one might say, fully bicultural. He came back to Ireland in 1567 and served in Queen Elizabeth's army against the Irish rebels in southern Ireland, and he even fought with an English contingent that was aiding the Protestant rebels against Spanish rule in the Netherlands. He was in fact hoping to have the best of both worlds, both culturally and politically. His goal was to combine both the English title, Earl of Tyrone, and the Irish chieftaincy, head of the O'Neills, in one person, himself. The trouble was that the claimant to the chieftaincy, who was around at the time of Shane's revolt, Turlough O'Neill, still had widespread support. So Hugh had his work cut out for him, and it took the better part of 3 decades for Hugh to work both systems and get both the English to recognize him as Earl of Tyrone and the Irish to recognize him as chieftain. But all of this careful work was undone by the 9 Years' War, which Hugh O'Neill did not actually start. It was started in 1593 by an alliance of other northern lords in combination with some prominent Catholic clerics. One of these clerics, Archbishop James O'Healy of Tuam, went to seek aid from the Spanish king Philip II. Keep in mind that Philip had suffered a catastrophic and very embarrassing defeat at the hands of the English in 1588, just a few years before, with the Spanish Armada. The Armada had had a disproportionate impact on the north of Ireland. In most parts of the country, the bedraggled Spanish sailors who actually made it to shore after braving the storms of the seas north of Scotland had simply been slaughtered. In Ulster, however, some 3,000 of them had been rescued and given shelter, and 500 of those made it over to Scotland. So anything involving a Spanish connection was going to set off loud alarm bells in the English administration. The rebels had some early successes, but Hugh O'Neill was still on the fence, it seemed, trying hard to choose between his Irish compatriots and the English who had backed him against his O'Neill rivals. This is why the English could never entirely trust him. They were never sure how far gratitude and self-interest would go in keeping O'Neill in the English fold. And they were right to be a bit worried, since Hugh was actually in close touch with the Spanish court via one of Philip's agents. A government report on O'Neill summed up the English government's concern. If O'Neill's purpose is to rebel, it must proceed with a combination from Spain. His rebellion will be the more dangerous and cost the Queen more crowns than any other that have foregone him since Her Majesty's reign. And this prediction proved accurate in every respect. In the latter half of 1595, Hugh O'Neill quietly took over the reins of the conspiracy from Red Hugh O'Donnell, who had been the leader up until then. From this point on, O'Neill was in charge, though O'Donnell was his very close associate. Hugh O'Neill was a really good commander. He had served in the Queen's army, where he had learned how to train pikemen and musketeers, so he was up to date on the latest weaponry. He was, of course, hampered in his campaigning by a lack of heavy artillery. There was just no way for him to get the large field guns that the English had access to. But he countered this deficit by an effective use of guerrilla tactics. So what did the rebels want? First, autonomy for Ireland, sort of an early version of home rule, if you like. But they accepted that Ireland would remain under the English crown, so they're not actually demanding complete independence. Religion also played a role, at least in the rhetoric of the rebels. They demanded that the church in Ireland be wholly governed by the Pope. That is, they're effectively denying the royal supremacy. And that, under Elizabethan law, was clearly treason. And the result was the biggest, most unified rebellion in the 400-plus years of English rule in Ireland. And the campaigning took place over a far wider area of Ireland than ever before. Queen Elizabeth was so alarmed by O'Neill's success that she sent her current court favorite, Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, to quash the rebellion in person. He went over with the most impressive army ever sent to Ireland, 16,000 troops. He had full viceregal powers. He had everything he needed to crush O'Neill. But what did he do instead? He received O'Neill's submission and made a truce with him. So Essex had squandered the best chance yet of beating O'Neill, and Elizabeth wasn't happy. He was summoned home, and knowing that he was in the doghouse, he started a rebellion himself as soon as he landed on English soil. He was caught and subsequently executed. But so much for that attempt to suppress O'Neill's revolt. Still, Elizabeth had other arrows in her quiver. She sent over a much better soldier in February of 1600 named Charles Blount, Lord Mountjoy. He had an actual strategy in mind for crushing O'Neill. He wanted to isolate him in his Ulster base by building forts at key locations all along the border of the province, and he wanted to starve O'Neill into submission, to use famine as a weapon. Mountjoy may have gotten the idea of starving the Irish from a work by the famous English poet Sir Edmund Spenser, who had served for many years as a colonial official in Ireland until he was driven off his estates by the rebels. Spenser's book, entitled A View of the Present State of Ireland, drew on stereotypes of the Irish as thieves and murderers that went all the way back to Gerald of Wales in the 12th century. Here is Spenser on the Irish. Marry, those be the most barbaric and loathy conditions of any people, I think, under heaven. They do use all the beastly behavior that may be. They oppress all men. They spoil as well the subject as the enemy. They steal. They are cruel and bloody, full of revenge, and delighting in deadly execution. Licentious, swearers and blasphemers, amen ravishers of women, and murderers of children. These were the ideas that were shaping English policymakers in their response to the rebellion. Now, O'Neill knew that Mountjoy was going to be a lot tougher as an opponent than Essex had been, so he redoubled efforts that had been underway for some time to recruit help from Spain. In January of 1601, Philip III of Spain, who had succeeded his father 3 years earlier, promised to send 6,000 men to Ireland. But due to various setbacks, by the time the fleet landed on September 21st at Kinsale, just south and west of Cork City, there were fewer than 4,000 troops on board. And when they landed, it turned out that the local rebels had already been defeated. Given the lack of immediate local support, the Spanish commander, Don Juan de Aguila, decided to hunker down inside Kinsale and wait for O'Neill to join him. Mountjoy moved in to besiege Kinsale, but O'Neill rushed south from Ulster to try to meet up with his Spanish allies. Now, Mountjoy's army had the rebels on one side and the Spanish garrison on the other. O'Neill attacked, but the maneuver he tried to pull off proved too confusing for his troops. He simply overshot their ability to carry out his orders. And it came down to a straight-out fight between the cavalry of both sides, and Mountjoy prevailed. The Spanish never even came out of their fortress, and after negotiating rather cravenly for a week or so, they finally surrendered on January 2nd, 1602. The defeat at Kinsale was the beginning of the end. Hugh O'Neill's army made its way very laboriously back to Ulster in terrible weather, while O'Donnell went off to Spain to seek for more help, unsuccessfully, and he died there, possibly of poison. Hugh O'Neill knew he was effectively beaten. He merely went underground as his supporters gradually trickled in to sue for pardon from the English, including Rory O'Donnell, the brother of his old compatriot. By the beginning of 1603, Elizabeth just wanted it all over, so she gave Mountjoy authorization to offer O'Neill life, liberty, and a pardon. In March of 1603, O'Neill agreed. He hung on for 4 more years, hoping that he would be able to reach an accommodation with the English regime, but in the end it proved impossible, and he, along with several companions, went into exile in 1607, never to return. The so-called Flight of the Earls can be said, with some oversimplification, to represent the end of the old Irish border. After departing from Lough Swilly in the north of Ireland, the Irish lords traced a path through all the major Catholic countries of Western Europe, and they finally landed in Rome. The Pope gave them pensions that were generous enough to allow them to live like gentlemen. O'Donnell died in July 1608 and was buried in the church of San Pietro in Montorio on the Janiculum Hill. O'Neill lived on, watched constantly by English agents, who reported that after dinner he had but one topic of conversation. His face would glow, he would strike the table, he would say that they would yet have a good day in Ireland. He never made it back to Ireland, and when he died in 1616, he was buried beside O'Donnell in Rome, where his grave can still be seen today. His arch-nemesis, the Lord Deputy Sir John Davis, could hardly contain his glee. This is what he said, and notice his familiarity with the story about St. Patrick expelling the snakes from Ireland. As for us that are here, we are glad to see the day wherein the countenance and majesty of the civil law and government has banished Tyrone out of Ireland, which the best army in Europe, and the expense of 2 millions of sterling pounds, did not bring to pass. And we hope His Majesty's government will work a greater miracle in this kingdom than ever St. Patrick did. For St. Patrick did only banish the poisonous worms, but suffered the men full of poison to inhabit the land still. But His Majesty's blessed genius will banish all those generations of vipers out of it, and make it, ere it be long, a right fortunate island. One way the English were trying to make Ireland a fortunate island was by extending the policy of plantation to Ulster. The English government was determined to dilute the Irishness of this most rebellious province by importing settlers from England and the nearby Scottish lowlands. Now, the Scots of the lowlands, as I have pointed out in other lectures, were very different from the Scots of the highlands. The lowlanders did not have linguistic or ethnic ties to Ireland. In fact, they were speakers of a dialect of English known as Scots, which descended from the language spoken in northern England in the Anglo-Saxon period. Many people know a little Scots without realizing it. The famous song Auld Lang Syne, from a poem by Robert Burns, uses the Scots term for old long since or long long ago. Many of them were in fact ethnically the same as the English, though they had adopted a Scottish political identity. By this point, that Scottish political identity brought with it a fervent commitment to a very strong branch of Reformed Protestantism, strongly Calvinist in outlook, that was based on the work of John Knox. They were utterly opposed to the Catholic faith. The Protestant English-speaking Scots and Englishmen were not going to mix very well with the Catholic Irish-speaking Irish. There were also some Scots settlers from the Gaelic-speaking Western Islands of Scotland, but the English government made sure that they were staunch Protestants. The mood among the Irish in this period was glum. I'll just read a quick excerpt of a poem attributed to Farflatha O'Neive, the O'Neill court poet, and its title tells us that the Irish knew that they faced both political and cultural ruin. It is called The Downfall of the Gaels. Through the woods let us roam, through the wastes wild and barren. We are strangers at home, we are exiles in Erin. The English had finally succeeded in subduing the entire island of Ireland, and they had done so partly by attacking Irishness itself, which, from the English perspective, meant converting Ireland from savagery to civility. Thank you for walking these ancient paths with us tonight. If you're still awake, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video so we can keep creating quiet stories for curious minds. Rest well, and remember there's always more. History waiting just beyond the horizon. This has been the Sleepless Historian. Good night.